Thanks very much, Phil. Hopefully you can see a picture of a slightly crazy looking mechanic up on your screen. Thanks a lot for having me today. Welcome to the cheese course in what has been a very heavy and protein-rich feast of insights into assessment and feedback. Mine, I guess, is not going to be too content heavy. It's not a case example, but hopefully it will leave you with some food for thought and maybe give you an aftertaste, which will help you think about how you use technology in your feedback. I think that the stuff I'm going to say has been pretty well exemplified in the presentations so far today, which is really pleasing to see because as Ed said, for example, a lot of the research and the studies in technology and feedback, they kind of, I think, sometimes lose the sense of the principles that scholars have developed about what constitutes good feedback. And I'll go into that a bit more in a second. But first, I thought it'd be useful to list some tools to think about in relation to feedback. And we've heard about various tools today. One of them is Turnitin and GradeMark, so a kind of repository for students to submit work to and an interface for providing comments that are in text and audio, etc. Wikis, which allow students to engage in collaborative open work using lots of media and things and allows sort of ongoing processes of feedback and insights into work in progress. Shared docs are good, like Google Docs or Microsoft Word shared docs when people want to work on mostly text stuff. So wikis are good if you want to link different pages together and embed media. But if really what you're doing is text-centric, then sometimes a shared doc is a bit easier and you can see students actually, you can see your collaborators working on the doc as it happens. You know, it's like a live thing with people's contributions appearing as you work. Discussion boards are very good because you can get students to submit something to that and then they can talk about each other's stuff and they can really engage in that dialogic feedback that we know is important over long periods of time. Polls, quick response platforms like Ombia, we've just heard about, are really good for like really fast, just-in-time feedback. Learning analytics can tell students about their digital traces of engagement, what tools they've been using, how, and they can sort of make predictions about what the student might need to do differently in order to move towards certain outcomes. I put email in there because actually it's a really important feedback tool. Probably most of the feedback processes that I engage with as a teacher on an online postgraduate program are to do with email. It can be quite personalized, one-on-one, and very dialogic over long periods of time. Video chat's an important one for like dissertation supervision, that sort of thing, meeting with students and having conversations with them. Some of the stuff in the literature, and don't get me wrong, these are good studies and they're useful, but they always sort of focus on a tool, so a wiki or audio feedback or learning analytics. And a couple of weeks ago, David Carlos asked me the question, what studies do you like that use tools in relation to principles of good feedback? And I found that a difficult question to answer, which in some ways inspired this talk, which is that I don't really like the ones that focus on the tool because the tool is only a small part of what's going on. It's really, for me, the practices around the tool that matter. And in a way, focusing on a tool foregrounds the tool and makes it seem like the tool does the work. And that's something that troubles me. So here I have this determinism and instrumentalism slide. If you let the technology determine what happens, so you say, I'm going to buy this tool and it's going to be a solution to my feedback problem, and that's really difficult because actually the technology doesn't determine what happens. The activities that go on around the tool are very important. And equally, if you say, well, pedagogy has to drive technology, then you are suggesting that you can decide what's going to happen and then neutrally use a tool to make that happen, which is a kind of instrumentalism and doesn't recognize the fact that technology shapes the pedagogy that goes on, and the pedagogy shapes the way that people use technology. And it's this kind of continuous reciprocal causation where you've really got to pay attention to the effect of each on the other. It isn't really possible, in my view, to separate technology and pedagogy. And some of the things that people spoke about kind of help us understand that, like Ed's example of the feedback diary around audio feedback, I think is a great example of how, rather than deciding on technology first and then a pedagogy, you've got to kind of adapt all of your practices to help students make sense of the feedback. So in a nutshell, anything where you say the teacher has to do stuff in order to make the feedback good, rather than thinking, well, actually, no, the teacher and the students both need to work together in order to make this feedback effective, is going to have limitations. So for me, I think what you need to do is you think about the context. What am I doing? Who's it with? What level is it at? What discipline is it at? And the purpose. What are we trying to achieve? And then have those as the basis for deciding on which methods are you going to use and which technologies are you going to use. And those decisions have to be done in combination. It's a kind of iterative process where you think about the ways that technology shapes what you're able to do, and you think about the activities that you want people to do and how that's going to shape their uses of technology, and then that turns into the practices that teachers and students do separately and together around their uses of technology. And those practices are very difficult to predict, so you have to kind of keep in touch with them. You have to know what is actually going on with those technologies. So here I have this kind of ecological metaphor. Technology has to be embedded into existing practices. One thing we know from research is that if you bring in a new technological solution and ask teachers and students to use it, what they'll do is they'll try to use it in a way that allows them to continue the practices they've become familiar with and have developed for themselves. So they'll subvert things. There's loads of examples of this. So in a way, what technology does is you don't just put it on top of a landscape like a Lego brick, but it's more like you're dropping some dye into a bowl of water, and that technology shapes everything else, but is also shaped by what's already there. So the practices that the teachers have already developed and the practices that the students have already developed need to be respected, because those people will want to maintain continuity of their practices even in the face of new technology. So practice doesn't exist in a vacuum. And I've said good education involves the situated application of principles. So what we need to do is remember the principles of good feedback: dialogic, timely, feeding forward into other tasks, advancing a sustainable assessment so that people can learn beyond the learning outcomes of a course and continue to learn beyond graduation. And that your approach cannot just be about the group of students in general, but needs to sort of attune to each individual so that it can be effective. So we can't just ignore the outlier students, for example. And the way that we need to do that is to personalize feedback, not by personalizing it for them, such as in the case of lots of learning analytics platforms, but actually enlisting students to try to make sense of what is a good process for them, and to have ongoing conversations with students so that we can understand what they think of the different applications and practices and technologies that are being used. Now, that might be quite onerous, so sometimes you can do that through open peer conversations and take some of the burden off the teacher. And actually, one of the real core things is making sure that the student isn't just involved in making sense of someone else's feedback comments given to them by a teacher or a peer or a learning analytics platform, but that they are also driving the processes, how feedback happens, what it's about, and that sort of thing. And that is in line with the sort of stuff that Ed was talking about what I still see as an aspirational move to a paradigm shift. I don't think we've actually shifted paradigms. We're just talking about it. We're moving towards it, but it hasn't happened yet until we really put students at the heart of driving what the processes look like. So that is a whirlwind tour through this kind of conceptual idea of thinking beyond the tools and thinking about the practices that we develop to work around the tools to make them work for our particular contexts, etc. I'll stop there because I think I'm nearly at 10 minutes and I want time for questions.
Thank you so much, Tim. That was really interesting. Nick, do you know if we've had any questions in the chat for Tim?
Yes, we have. So Roberta has said, I agree providing feedback has become much more complex because of consistency, accessibility, purpose, and timing. Did you have to rationalize the range of technologies you used or create a matrix to evaluate them before being considered for use?
Thank you. That sounds really systematic. My approach is generally not as systematic as that. And like I said, there's always already technologies in place and practices in place when you arrive somewhere. So you don't, I wouldn't just develop a matrix and then just use that to say that's what we're doing without considering what students are already used to. If you bring in a really radical change, it's probably going to take a few years before that really is ironed out and works nicely, because you've got so much kind of attunement to do. You've got to evaluate it with students and work out how to try a little bit of trial and error and reconfiguration over time. So I think for me, it's a bit more less about just using a matrix to decide what to do and more about being open to adapting. So we do use Turnitin and GradeMark. One of my concerns about Turnitin is that it foregrounds distrust. So if every student has to submit an essay to a plagiarism detection software, then you are giving an additional kind of feedback comment, which is that we don't inherently trust you. You need to sort of move through this benchmark, this gateway first before a teacher even sees your work. And so to try to get around that, we have these, I guess, what you might call subversive practices, where actually we talk about that in advance. We've now actually just disabled the originality check so that it still works as a repository. And we use audio and in-text feedback through GradeMark, and we know that that's basically monologic, that the interface itself does not help students to talk back to those comments. So we do things like record conversations with the other tutors about how we've gone about marking and what students should do afterwards, and then we have discussion boards for students to kind of talk about their experiences of the marking, what they thought. And we open up conversations by saying, please email me if you have concerns, but we're also aware that that's pretty limited because most people won't take us up on that, which in a way is good because we wouldn't have time. So there's loads of tensions in saying we certainly haven't figured it out, but I would say that rather than kind of systematically using a matrix to figure it all out, it has to be this ongoing conversation and ongoing adaptation of practices.
That's great, thank you.
We've also got a question in the chat from Ruth. Ruth, do you want to unmute yourself to ask Tim your question?
Hi, Tim. Yeah, no, that was really fascinating set of presentations, and especially sort of having yours at the end to sort of capstone it all about. It's all about tools, and certainly at JISC we certainly endorse that approach. But as you say, it's iterative, that you've got to kind of know what the tools could do in order to work out whether it's suitable or not, and whether, and especially with innovation. But on your sort of point about, I think we're hearing a lot more in all sorts of walks of life about engaging students or customers or consumers in product and service development. So I was just wondering, especially around feedback, whether you, Tim, and in fact any of the other presenters that have talked today, how do you involve students in designing that feedback? Because as you said, things are moving on. So expectations, experiences are moving on. So as we get more diverse ways of communicating, expectations change as well. So there's been a big rise in audio books now. So people are much more used to listening to books as well as reading them. So how do you engage students in designing up front and also through the improvement process of feedback.
I see Ed's got his hand up. I don't know if it's Phil. Should I have a quick shot and then pass over to Ed then?
Absolutely, yeah.
So thanks, Ruth. First of all, my first thing would be to try to make sure nobody actually sees students as customers and teachers as service providers. I think that's fundamentally at odds with all of the stuff that we're trying to do here.
No, sorry, I didn't mean that in education, it is very much about transformation rather than transactional. But in transactional products and services, customers are give a lot more feedback because it's much more about a service rather than a product. So you buy, all sorts of commercial organisations do a lot more. So when in education we hear about survey fatigue or feedback on feedback kind of fatigue, really, we're as as citizens, we are getting more used to giving feedback because more products and services outside of education ask it of us.
Yeah, sorry, I wasn't casting aspersions at you.
Yeah, no, I know. I know it's a very hot topic.
The way I see it is to make sure that we stop thinking of feedback as information. So I don't want kind of feedback from students about how I should change my feedback. I want to involve them in developing new processes and practices, so that they talk about not just what kind of information do I want, but actually how do I want to engage with teachers and students around the work that I'm doing and how to understand that. So in some ways it's too late to just do that at the end when they've handed in an assignment. You've got to involve them in actually designing the course in a way and how the communication is going to work in that course. And a lot of that will require some teaching up front about how to get students to understand what you're even talking about. Like if you just say, help me design the course so the feedback's better, they'll have these kind of traditional models that they've experienced and they won't really understand what that means. So some of it will be actually trying to help them understand these principles of feedback that are being produced in the literature, and then working with them to think, well, how are we going to enact these in ways that suit the stuff that students do and the ways that they need to understand it and what they need to do with it in the future.
Ed, did you want to jump in there?
Yeah, I agree exactly what Tim's saying there, and I think it's about a cultural change in the purpose of feedback and getting away from, as Tim says, it being at the end of a product, and it's actually more about the process, but articulating in terms of students understanding how they've utilised feedback, but also how it's that exchange between peers and learners, so that there's a more open and honest sharing process of giving and receiving feedback throughout the process of creating whatever assessment you're going to submit. So I think if we can change that, but I think the other thing that Tim's mentioning there is that what COVID has taught us is that as a sector, we've been able to respond rapidly and we've been able to change things that we were previously told had to take 2 years, for example, to change. So if you want to get students involved in designing assessments or designing modules, then the system behind that needs to allow you to be able to modify your delivery and modify what you're doing, rather than having to submit things that take 18 months to 2 years to come into effect. Because to use the customer analogy, the most frustrating thing is that you don't affect your own process, you affect others. And I think if you can, as a student, see that what you give to your academic actually has a demonstrable change on your experience, then that's going to have more of a benefit than something that you're helping students 3 years down the line, because that isn't going to help you. So I think it's changing the understanding of what feedback's for and how it can benefit learners.
Great, thank you very much. I think we'll stop the questions there if that's okay, because I think we've reached time. Yeah, very interesting talk. Please feel free to continue in the chat if you want to. But yeah, I would just like to finish by saying a huge thank you to everyone who's presented today from the University of Kent and also outside of the University of Kent. So Adam and Tim, thank you so much for coming along today and kind of sharing your experiences. And I think it's looking at the chat, I think it's been really well received. So I'm very pleased. So thank you very much.